Thank you very much. Let me first of all apologize for canceling the press conference earlier this week. As you are aware now that there was a development, and the President asked that the entire cabinet take their tests for COVID-19, and so we did not want to have any activity from the moment we found out that one of our colleagues had been in contact with someone who tested positive. And so the entire cabinet took the COVID test, and everyone was negative, excepting, unfortunately, one of our colleagues. And so she is now in isolation and following the guidelines laid out by the ministry. Both of the colleagues who have been tested positive. They continue to work from home, however, from isolation. And so by now most of you would have, in the past week or so of the new government, would have heard from various ministers. You have heard from the President about their findings in this short period of time and what are their priorities. I've seen a long list of priorities established by the ministers in their various sectors. And many of them can do so with the ease that they did, largely because we have great clarity about what we want to achieve. And that clarity found itself or manifested itself in a document that we presented to the electorate, which was quite comprehensive in nature as to what we want to achieve for Guyana and for our people. And so we intend to faithfully implement the promises we made to the electorate. And the timing of this, or the implementation of the promises, will be discussed further because of our current assessment of the situation, which I'll share with you. But you would have noticed from the very first day that the President took office or was sworn in, he had a meeting with a large number of people to deal with the COVID pandemic. And that ranks number one in his list of priorities. And that's why he himself led the effort. And I do not know how much of that meeting has been reported as to the findings. But for me personally, sitting in that room and listening to the people who were charged with leading our efforts in the past several months, frankly speaking, it was shocking about the state of this organization and the lack of a clear strategy to address an existential issue for Guyana. And for those of you who saw what took place, you would recognize, for example, that the individuals were quick to give descriptive presentations about what is taking place, how many people have contracted the virus. And we said to them, we can read that in the newspapers. We want, because the newspapers and the media has been disseminating the information to the public. What we would like to get from you is to how to fix the problem and what help do you need to fix the problem. So first of all, how many tests can you do per day? And they did not know what was the capability of the country and how many tests per day could be done. So there was a consultation. And then finally they said the government has the capability of doing 100 tests per day. So we said, where do you want to get up to get ahead of the pandemic curve? How many tests per day do you need to do? And they did not know. So there was a consultation, a quick consultation, and then they said 350. I still think it's a number plucked out of nowhere, but that's what the meeting was told, 350. So we said, how many testing kits do you have? We asked, and they had 2,000 testing kits. And in the entire country, because the private sector did not have any. And we said, well, if you have 2,000 testing kits and you have to get up to 350 tests per day, that's only 6 days of testing. And then we're out of testing kits. So we asked the gentleman from PAHO, how long would it take to get the kits in? And he said 2 months, additional kits. So in 6 days, we would have used up all of our kits if we're testing at the level they want to do, test that. And then it will take 2 months to get additional testing kits. So that was the state of affairs. And that is why I can relay to you or a ton of other issues that we found regard to the structures, etc. The structures were political in nature, extremely political. Harman's unit was made up mainly of politicians, not people to address medical or even people with socioeconomic experience to address the pandemic. Even the contact tracing, and many of the people hired there were political people. So there was no appropriate structure apart from the procurement and material deficit. There was no, there wasn't the appropriate structure to address the pandemic. And then they had grave issues about capabilities for quarantining and as well as addressing a medical response, emergency rooms, etc. And so that is what the president found, and he immediately said, we have to fix this. And so he started engaging the international community and PAHO directly, as a result of which we now would have, maybe within a month, about 50,000 testing kits. The Ministry of Health has already embarked upon getting additional machines to test, the PCR machines, so that you have that capability. We spoke with Prime Minister Motley, and I saw some criticism of, we are directly procuring testing kits. But Prime Minister Motley said, my representative is coming to Guyana for the inauguration. I will send in 10,000 testing kits on the same aircraft. And we got 10,000 kits in. So the efforts at the ministry has been enormous in terms of getting more material, more capability to test, as well as the testing kits. Simultaneously, they are reforming, based on the president's instruction, the organization of the effort with a very few people at the policy level, but giving broad policy directions. And these are politicians, mainly the Prime Minister and the Minister of Health, working along with international organizations, and then putting in place a technical structure to deal both with the medical response as well as the socioeconomic response. So allowing the doctors, etc., to deal with this issue. And that is what has been happening in the last week or so. Aggressive work in this regard. We found that, that a lot of the people who are in Frontline, the sad story from the doctors and the nurses, they are dealing with, there's disease, well, not disease, but pandemic, and they're in the front line, but they feel that they're not adequately equipped with PPEs, nor are they rewarded for this. And I want to assure them that the President has indicated that in the next budget, there will be, in the budget upcoming, that there will be an appropriate recognition of their work. That will be done in the next budget. We have also seen the total. There's so many things that we can talk about here, but the President has also announced in his inauguration speech $4.5 billion of direct assistance to communities. Right now, we are looking at how the money could be dispersed in a transparent way and how it could reach the people who actually need the help, because there are large numbers of people out there who need assistance from the government of Guyana through either help for food to feed their families or some cash assistance. The major issue before us now is whether we can use money from the Treasury or we may have to raise this in the interim before there is a budget through borrowing. And then once the budget is passed, to repay that loan. And I'll come to this point in greater detail when I talk to you about the budget and what has happened and what the financial laws permit and what they don't permit. So, but that assistance that the President announced, we're looking at raising it and how best to intermediate it in a rapid fashion. Now, the country would want to know how much assistance has been given to people across the country in terms of direct assistance. And even with CDC, I did a quick costing when they were making a presentation, could not be more than 75 million Guyana dollars of direct assistance to the people in the communities who need the help. On the other hand, they've spent huge sums of money on this hospital, which, as you are aware by now, is not equipped to deal with the pandemic, and therefore will have to either undergo major renovation or equipping and retrofitting, and even that may not work. So, and you would also know that the individual who claims he owns the land, he stayed quiet throughout the several months that the media was questioning what's going on with the hospital. And suddenly, the first week of the new government, he sent a lawyer's letter he wants to be paid billions of dollars. Well, I must say that he'd have a long wait. Because we believe that a lot of irregularities, illegalities, and took place through this deal, and that will be fully investigated. Apart from that, the President himself and the Office of the President, we've had several outreaches to either through the World Bank or the European Union, IDB, and several other bilateral sources to start raising money to be directed to addressing this pandemic. It would require hundreds of millions of US dollars if we're going to have the appropriate response. And so we started off through our bilateral and multilateral partners. We've had several meetings with them. They have made some commitments. I'm not going to outline all of those, but the commitments have already been made, and we're going to aggressively pursue the conclusion of these arrangements and the disbursement through a transparent mechanism, and hopefully you will see much more of this in the budget when it comes out, when the Minister of Finance presents the budget. This will be dealt with. Apart from that, the President announced again in his speech, the inauguration speech, that we were looking at two things from a central bank perspective. Apart from other issues, he's very concerned about working capital for banks, and not just banks, but for businesses. And he's concerned about liquidity available to the consuming public and those who want to restart business, because we have had a look at the impact of the pandemic on businesses, and we have had a massive deterioration in the economy. I'll speak about that in a moment, because of the pandemic and other issues. So he mentioned a couple of things in the speech about the central bank suspending elements of the supervisory guideline through the regulatory process that they use. They send out these supervisory guidelines to the bank. So they're going to suspend some aspects of the supervisory guideline to allow the banks, or to extend this and to continue to allow the banks to renegotiate interest rates, which was prohibited under the supervisory guideline, and to give them more time to classify loans as bad debts. Because if they don't have to classify the loans as bad debts in the near term, then they do not have to make a provisioning from their gross profit for those loans that are classified as a bad debt, and therefore it wouldn't affect their profitability. So there is that direction to the central bank, and the central bank has already started to engage the banking sector in relation to implementing that. Secondly, as the President mentioned, that we're looking at relaxing the reserve requirement. And you know, banks are required to make a deposit with the central bank, which is a percentage of the deposits. And so to the extent that they have to make that deposit with the central bank for prudential purposes, that money is not available to them to lend. And it's a cost to the banks. So the idea is to look at reducing the reserve requirement for the banks so they have more funds available at their disposal. But in exchange for that, so that the benefit doesn't go just to the banks, to tie that reduction in the reserve requirement to a reduction in interest rates for business and for other individuals who are borrowing. And so that is a crucial issue, because the cost of capital is an impediment to those who want to borrow and those who want to resume business. And the idea is to treat the pandemic seriously, build our capability to tackle it, make sure that we have strong protocols in every sector for the reopening of the economy, but at the same time, that reopening is just as vital. So it's striking the balance between addressing the pandemic through a strong medical response and reopening the economy so people who don't have jobs and who can't earn a living and whose lives are being disrupted, they too can go out, but in controlled environment, taking all the safeguards and following the protocols that they can then earn a living. President has given clear directions about the schools. I think the Minister of Education has mentioned that he wants school open as early as possible, but in a safe way, and to get our children to go back to school. So this is not going to, I don't think it will happen in September, because the infrastructure out there, the schools are not ready as yet. And so there will be help to the Department of Education to get that done. These are just a few of the things that are being done over the last few days to make sure that, as I said before, that the capability is built, that we can ramp up testing. And let me say this, that a lot of people feel stigmatized if they have contracted the virus. This is like a flu. Anybody could get it. It's not anything to be ashamed of, and a lot of people have avoided testing because of this fear that they will be stigmatized, they and their families. That is why we also took the test in a public way to show that there's nothing wrong with this. It's anybody. People are victims of this. You know, you can just go down the road and and contract this. You can touch a surface and contract this. And so we want the population to be aware of this and seek testing if they fear that they may have contracted the virus, because there's nothing to be ashamed of. So, as I said before, much more you would hear much more from the sectors. I'm sure that you've heard a lot from Dr. Anthony about our findings in the health sector outside of COVID, about billions spent without drugs in the hospital, removal of drugs from the bond to private suppliers' places. We've been finding that. Large sums of money spent on contract without drugs being delivered through corrupt deals. All of these things. Political people hired through the ministries and now placed in key positions for which they are not qualified. These are overtly political individuals. I'm not talking about, someone who supports a party, which people have a right to do. People have a right to support any political party, and they must not fear any recrimination because of their political affiliation. But I'm talking about political types who have been openly on the campaign trail, and aggressively so. They're placed in various areas. I want to talk a bit now about the economy. Let me say a few words here. So we had some anecdotal evidence of the decline in the economy, and we suspected that resources were being utilized for purposes for which they are not intended. And that investigation is ongoing. So as the months unfold, you're going to see the findings, because we want to do a professional job and we want to take our time at doing this to ensure that the people of this country understand the excesses that took place. So from the National Tender Board to the regional tender boards, you're going to see an examination of the contracts that were issued, and I was shocked to see how many were issued without any form of tendering, direct procurement. But we don't want to be partial. The investigations will take place, and you will have details, and you will see to whom the contracts were given and the procurement method and who authorized these contracts. All of these will be available in the near future. And we have to be thorough too, because we don't want to be unfair to the technical people, to blame them for things that they may not have control over, or some of them were directed to carry out these functions. So that will happen soon. We're in NISIL. The President has already changed the board. A new board has been appointed by the Cabinet, and that board will be installed shortly. The President had a meeting. I was in that meeting with the Attorney General too, and we asked for several bits of information. A lot of them have not been produced. We asked for the land issues. On the campaign trail, we made it very clear that we want to see who bought these lands, at what price, and what procurement method was used. And so we are still not in receipt of all of them. They're selectively submitted some of these documents. Again, this would be made available. We've made a commitment to the public that we will release all of this. We have seen evidence of properties vested, large amounts of land vested in individual names and companies' names, although they have not paid. Now that's a transfer. Once it's vested, it's transferred to them without them paying the requisite fee or price, or paying a small portion of the sale price. And that also, you're going to get, the public will get a list. We've asked for, at the estates, at all the estates across the country, because NISIL, all the sugar assets were transferred to NISIL, and NISIL owns Gaisuco at this point in time, because the shares were transferred to NISIL too. We've asked for a list of all the assets that were disposed of on all these estates, and the form that they used to dispose of the assets. You should see, we haven't received all of this as yet. We've asked for the houses. There are a large number of houses on these estates. They're being disposed of or rented to individuals or leased to them at some unbelievably low prices. You'll get that too. As you know by now, NISIL has not had an audit in any of the 5 years of the last government. The last audit was in 2014. So that was the last year that the PPP full year that the PPP was in office. They have not had an audit of their accounts for the past 5 years. We asked about the loan, the bond. We're told just over $17 billion were received by the government, and the balance now is just over $4 billion remaining in NISIL. There are a whole range of other issues that can't be dealt with remotely, and so that is why we thought it's so urgent to put in place a board, because there are tons of assets there that the people of the country need to know what transpired with these assets. And we have seen evidence of change in contracts, or like removal of certain clauses from certain leases, it's dependent on who is acquiring the asset. Like similar to the Joseph Harmon contract, which had no termination clause. So you have a lot of those sorts of issues, and we will deal with those matters too. I've seen, anyhow, don't deal with that. The board will deal with that. I'm just getting to deal with too many things. So I just wanted to say to you, just be a little patient, because there would be a new board in place, and all of these things that we promise to make public before the elections in our numerous discussions with the public, or presentations to the media. The President did it on the campaign trail, on the platform. All of these would be made available to the media. You have heard about lots of other agencies. I'm not going to deal with those. So in that environment, we have to craft a budget urgently. We don't have a budget for the year. So when we had the first budget meeting, we were told that it takes 179 days to prepare a budget, from the date the circular goes out to the date of presentation in Parliament. This is the standard, 179 days. And it sounded a bit like low and feel. So we have made it clear that we want the budget prepared, and we are working towards preparing a budget within 3 weeks, 21 days. So the 179 days in the normal cycle will have to come down to about 3 weeks. And the reason why this is so is because the country, the help that people need in many of the sectors can't be made available to them unless, and to reboot the economy, unless we have an early budget. So we'll have to work overtime to get the budget ready, and not three weeks. So what is making this even more complicated is that, as you know, we are changing the nomenclature of the ministries back to the old structures. So that means we also, whilst preparing the budget, we have to also change the IFMA system to revert back to the old structures, the structures of ministries, so that you can have a smooth disbursement of resources, etc. This requires shifting of programs, which we are now looking at, because programs were put everywhere on the different ministers, and often very political programs. So like Amnali had a few, and this person had something else, different slush funds. that were not properly audited, nor did they have any synergy with the ministry in which they were implemented. So we are doing that right at this point in time to see that the structure is an efficient one, that we can reduce administrative costs, which skyrocketed under the last government, and that we can have synergies. So that change is currently being made to the IFMAS system to allow the preparation of the budget. So that is even more complicating. In a normal cycle with a regular IFMAS system, it takes 179 days. So this is something that we are working on aggressively. Now, the economy as of mid-year, from what we're told, the non-oil economy. So the oil economy grew by 45.9%. That's what I'm told, even up to today. The non-oil economy, it shrunk by 4.9%. So that shows the impact. If you take out oil and gas, our economic activities shrunk by 4.9, nearly 5% for the first half of the year. So clearly it requires a lot of help. This sector of the economy needs a lot of help to resume positive growth. And these are the sectors of our economy that have the greatest linkages to other sectors, and they're the labor-intensive sectors of our economy. So we'd have to come up with a number of measures, and some of those I've outlined earlier, more working capital, direct help to the private sector, more stimulus, etc., to the economy, to see that we can stop this decline and reverse it in the non-oil economy. I'm told that, like, for example, wholesale and retail trade shrunk by mid-year by 14%, transport by 25%, accommodation by 33%, bauxite by 42%, other mining by 57%. So a lot of the sectors, forestry, fisheries, etc., went into decline, significant decline. So this is right now, this, as you can see, it would require a series of measures in the new budget, but an approach by the government to see that these sectors resume growth. The deficit up to mid-year, although we didn't have a budget, $116 billion was disbursed from the Treasury, and that was mid-year. If you extrapolate, say, at the end of July, using the same ratio, like divide 116 by 6, it would be nearly $135 billion. So that is what the expenditure has been for the year so far. And the revenue was $111 billion. So the revenue also shrunk based away from the targeted growth. Of this, I just want to point out to you on the capital side, because a lot of this is the recurrent releases through the 112 provision. But on the capital side, you have had some $34 billion approved. And so this is crucial that last year, just before the elections, the government went on a corrupt spending spree. And many of the ministries awarded contracts, although they knew they didn't have money to fulfill the contracts, because if you're awarding a contract in November and December, you cannot implement the contract fully. So $21.7 billion rolled over from last year, this is on the capital side, into this year's budget. So that means that the new government is starting now with $21.7 billion already spent or catered for. So you now, that reduces your allowance on the capital side by 22 billion nearly. That is on just rollover projects. Then you have to, in the new budget, also, Winston Jordan, he made a loan to GPL of $10.7 billion. And this was not a loan for public service. So this was, in my view, an illegal disbursement. Nowhere in our financial laws would they allow the Minister of Finance to disburse from the consolidated fund $10.7 billion in a loan for capital expenditure, because this was used to pay for some Wärtsilä plant that they were buying. So that was another disbursement that would have to be reflected in this year's budget too. And then they released for COVID related activities from on the capital side, $1.1 billion, $1.134 billion to the Ministry of Health and $150 million to the regions. So that's $1.284 billion. So this is money, this is only on the capital side. So we are starting the budget now with $34 billion on the capital side spent already. That's only on the capital side. And $135 billion here overall. So this is a situation. So that's one of the environment. I'm not trying to overload you with numbers, just to paint a picture of the things that are hamstringing us in ensuring that we can pass a budget with a lot of room for help, because so much of the expenditure has already been committed or expended. Now, we also, just to give you a feel for the overdraft at the central bank, it's $84 billion. So when you talk about where government is financing this large expenditure, it comes from borrowing. And this is borrowing from the central bank through an overdraft of $84 billion, which at some point in time we'd have to clear. But that's not the only borrowing. They borrowed from the private sector for the financing of the budget, that is for fiscal purposes, through the issuance of treasury bills, another $70 billion. So you're talking about $150 billion of financing, over $150 billion of financing. That's about $750 million US of financing for budgetary purposes. That's the extent of the domestic borrowing. Might not be everything, but this just to give you a picture as to the level of the borrowing that took place. So we are working, the President has directed the ministers to deal with their key priorities. The public corporations have been notified about the need to submit their budget on time. They're given deadlines, I think the public corporations and other agencies are Wednesday next week, and Monday the ministries have to make their submissions available. We can move on, and then we can accelerate the process. We, needless to say, that's only on the central government side. In terms of public corporations, we have not had the quick assessment completed as yet, so we don't have the figures, but I can tell you from what I've gone through and what I've seen that Gaisuco will be in deficit, Power and Light, these are the big ones, Guyana Power and Light major deficit, GWI deficit, Forestry Commission deficit, a lot of agencies, almost or most of the big agencies which would require help from the central government to meet either their development needs or in many cases, like in GFC's case, even recurrent costs, not just capital injections in some of these areas. So it's a really sad situation now on the side of the public corporations and many of the statutory agencies which have huge deficit. The Gold Board has a massive deficit, over $4 billion at the central bank too. These are just some of the issues. Now, we've also embarked upon an aggressive look at a survey of all the resources available, apart from the revenue forecast, all the resources available, and we have already had meetings with the project department in the Ministry of Finance to look at reprioritizing expenditure through both our multilateral and bilateral engagement or relationship. And this is non-COVID type of expenditure. So this is more development expenditure. So it's a reprogramming or programming either 18, either 19, which is the World Bank Group. Then the IDB, we've reached out to the EU OPEC, Islamic Development Bank, the meetings with the Indian government to look back at the projects that were there, that were never implemented, the ocean-going ferry for Northwest, because those people are in major difficulties there, the road project which was supposed to be funded, the bypass road, help on a number of other areas, resources that were there, that since 2015 they were there and never used in a priority fashion. And so there has been a lot of work in the past week on trying to make sure that all of our multilateral and bilateral engagements are looked at. We have mapped out the resources and we are starting to program some resources or reprioritize. And then we're trying to fulfill the conditions which are there, in some cases, precedent to disbursement. So we've embarked on that process too, because a lot of these things require the President has also directed that we explore the bond market, and we have already started doing some outreaches in that regard, because there may be need for short-term financing until the economy picks up, and therefore that may be a quick disbursing facility, but it would also allow us to accelerate the development plan that we campaign on, say in the housing sector and many other sectors. So the President has already asked that we look at the bond market, and we're currently exploring that, and we want to make sure that there would be a number of proposals so we get the best term sheet if we were to go this route, if we make a final decision to go that route, because now we're just exploring it. So at some point in time in the near future, there will be more details on this. We believe the President has asked, as you've seen, that Office of the President would have oversight responsibility for both oil and gas and finance, but that doesn't mean that there will not be core ministers. There must be core ministers with oversight responsibility. So day-to-day functions of those offices must not be done by the Office of the President. We'll have more oversight responsibility, and especially in the transitional period, so to give guidance to the sectors and to establish systems within those ministries that could be, can be self-propelling. So we'll talk a bit more about that at some point in time. So there could very well be in the near term a Minister of Finance, and I wanted to tell you that because we are more the President at the Office of the President, and I'm assisting him in implementing his agenda. We want to have more of an oversight responsibility. Now that brings me right to the oil and gas, because that is both for finance and oil and gas. So the Minister of Natural Resources, who has been appointed, is in charge of the sector. The Department of Energy will be transferred to him. We made a campaign pledge, and we spoke at several press conferences that the Ministry of the Presidency at that time, or the Office of the President, must not have a day-to-day oversight responsibility. The President at that time did not even read the contracts, but had to sign technical things. And we believe that that should be done immediately. So under the new portfolio, gazetted portfolio, the Department of Energy will fall under the Minister of Natural Resources. Now, the idea is to swiftly, maybe over the next 6 to 8 months or so, and even if we could do it faster, to move to the establishment of a petroleum commission, as we had said before. The Petroleum Commission will be a mainly technical commission, because what you need is technical oversight with some of the best brains, and we hope that Guyanese would heavily be involved there, with, of course, some foreign help until we can train our people. But let me say this right at the beginning. The President has insisted, not just in the oil and gas sector, but in almost every other sector, we want to see a prominent place for Guyanese in the management of these areas and in terms of benefiting from these areas. So that philosophy will cut across the entire government. So this will happen once we have a technical commission. Less functions will be, so the implementation of day-to-day functions would be done more by a technical commission rather than having more ministerial input or input from the Office of the President. The Office of the President and the Minister will give more of a policy input. So they're required to clear policies, etc., or to ensure that they remain faithful to the policy direction. So the policy directions will be clearly there, and we can talk a bit about what the policy directions should be. The President has also made it clear that he will establish shortly an advisory group to himself on the petroleum, on oil and gas. An advisory group will be put in place, made up of mainly Guyanese, who will be advising the President on these issues. So that is in terms of how the structures. and their relationship. So we are in a transition, but we want to transition into more technical bodies doing much more of the oversight work over the oil and gas sector. Now, there are several issues that we see as priority. We have argued throughout it all that there has to be, and we made it clear in the meetings with ExxonMobil, that we want them to do well. This is directly with ExxonMobil, forget the sector for the time being. We want them to do well here, to make money, but Guyanese must share this prosperity. That it's not sustainable otherwise. And we will insist that that happens. That Guyanese must share the prosperity. That if they're doing well, our people must do well too, in terms of opportunities, employment, etc. And that will be the guiding principle, the philosophy in all of our engagements with ExxonMobil, and subsequently, once we start looking at the other contracts, then with all of them. So there are several areas that we have identified that have serious shortcomings that we believe in the near term or medium term can bring enormous benefits to our people. And these areas they must be, ExxonMobil has to treat these areas seriously. Has to treat the areas seriously. First of all, the area of local content. The brief that we got from the Department of Energy said, we asked specifically, have you moved to develop legislation? And no, there is no draft legislation at this time. They have various position papers. From what we gathered from the newspapers in opposition, and then from the briefing itself, that there were others who had suggested ideas and those ideas were more beneficial to Guyanese without harming Exxon's ability to pursue its business. But those ideas were not taken on board and have not been taken on board. So the President's decision was, we've seen that. I recall having a discussion with Mr. Paul when he came here. There have been other, we've seen a document that he produced. We're yet to study the document, but there's been an outreach to him to look once we start working on the local content. And the local content will be in the form of legislation. It will be mandatory on the company to comply with the legislation. And that must, so there will be all the best technical inputs. We want to get the best technical inputs before we come up with a negotiating brief that will be cleared at the policy level, and then we want to engage directly with Exxon to see that this happens. Now, the President will meet also with the entire local Guyanese community, because through series of meetings, maybe with the sectors, to listen to them about their views on local content. Not to farm the consultation out on local content policy to a junior person or the Department of Energy. He will deal with it directly at that level, so that people will be free to express their views. We have heard from the Guyanese public. We have seen how labor is treated, and we have seen how the business, that opportunities that could have come to Guyanese are farmed out to people, non-Guyanese, and these are not the opportunities that are building an FPSO or areas where we don't have capacity. So that has to happen, that the Exxon would have to look at this. We made it clear to ExxonMobil too that the subcontractors, they can't claim that, well, that's our subcontractor who is doing this, and therefore in our engagement we try to meet the local content provisions do as much as possible on local content, because a lot of their work is farmed out to subcontractors who operate here in Guyana, who have been paying our people basically wages that are discriminatory, not comparable wage for comparable skill. And that is what we will insist on, that they must be paid fairly, and two, that the subcontractors too, and so all of those who have been bringing in people where we have some of the skills, that those subcontractors too, that they have to observe the strict local content legislation when it comes on board. And the President has expressed a great desire to train large number of Guyanese, that we have to assist large numbers of Guyanese, raise this with ExxonMobil, and we have to find, they would have to contribute to that training. And we don't think the paltry sum of $300,000 per year is adequate. So that is one area that will be dealt with soon, and this is a priority of the government. The second area is the gas to energy project. Now, it seems as though ExxonMobil was interested in moving rapidly with this, but the government of Guyana put the roadblocks in this regard because they did not respond, I gather, and we're still to find out, and we're going to get the details later about who bought up the lands on the proposed locations where the pipeline would have come. We have now a couple of studies that we're going through. And so at some point in time we'll get to that. But we can't look at what they did not do. We want to get this done urgently. So we will, of course, have to be guided by technical people. All of this we have to be guided by the best technical minds. But we want this project on the road as early as possible. And in that engagement, we will have to get the gas at a cost that is very different than in the contract. We're signaling this. So now the contract locks in a price for the gas that is at least for the first 300-400 megawatts of power, because we need the electricity to industrialize this country. We need it we can generate more jobs, and we also need the electricity so we can fulfill the promise we made to people that we'll cut their electricity bill. You heard the President mention that significantly, and as much as by half of what they're paying now. And this is a project that has high priority. We want to engage with Exxon. Of course, there are other things to look at. The availability of gas now at this point in time, how much is available, and who will own the facility, whether it will be a public-private partnership, it will be advertised and maybe to any company to do the whole project and then sell the gas, the power to government at a low cost, or it will be a government-owned project, totally government-owned. All of those decisions have to be made, and they will be dependent upon the resources available as well as what the market offers. You know, if we have interests and the interests are viable and good for the country. So that decision has to be made, but we want to get this done as swiftly as possible. And so that is, and ExxonMobil, I think, is eager to move along with this project too, because from what I gather, they've been waiting for quite a while for the government to show major interest in moving this forward. So on the environment, this is another area. And having said what we just said about gas, we have to ensure that we have a commitment from ExxonMobil that as we sit down to discuss this, because all of these issues are interlinked and they're the key issues in the contract, that a commitment that there will be adequate provisions for any environmental disaster, that there will be adequate provisions in the contract and by Exxon for environmental disasters. We have to satisfy ourselves that that is so, and also flaring is a key issue, and we'd have to deal. We've already signaled that we don't want flaring, but how soon we can get to that, if we can move immediately or not, or but we don't want flaring. We don't want flaring. So that is it. But of course, how soon you get to that will be an issue. And I'm just giving you the areas of the contract that we have signaled to ExxonMobil that there are major concerns about. Payara development plan and the field development, as you're aware, much has been written about this, and the government has hired a consultant who is now reviewing the development plan. The brief is that they will complete that review sometime by the 24th of this month. And we've made it clear that, consistent with what we said before, that we want to move the production along, but we also want to make sure that the country benefits from this. And given in the public domain how much was written about the procurement process through which the government embarked upon to hire the consultants, not just this consultant, but consultants that were advising them, the President decided that we should have a review of the work done by the consultants, and that technical review will guide the decision of the government. But we made it clear, it's not, we don't want to delay, but all the I's must be dotted and the T's crossed. And we want to make sure that on that issue, there's a proper technical evaluation. That's a technical issue about field development, etc. And you need the consultants to look at those issues. You know, there's no expertise. It's not a policy issue. There's no expertise in the cabinet or so to make that call. So we'd have to be guided by the review that we got some help from the Canadian government to hire a consultant to do that review. And so that is as it relates to the Payara development. There would be the Natural Resources Fund. This has nothing to do with Exxon now, but the Natural Resources Fund will be very soon either repealed or amended, but repealed and amended, or amended just like that, you know, through a bill. But clearly we have a number of issues with the Natural Resources Fund, and one of which is the overwhelming dominance of the influence of the Minister of Finance on this sector and the use of the funds. And therefore, we want to have, as we made it clear, a more arm's length relationship directly from arm's length relationship in terms of the management of these funds. That was our fundamental problem with the bill and the act that was passed. I want to say that in the near term too, as soon as we get over this hump, when the government starts working, that we will conduct a review of the other licenses too, that these would all have to be reviewed. And as you know, we indicated we want to work on a model agreement, and therefore the model agreement, depending on what we work on and how swiftly we get there, will guide our engagements with the other licensee, the other people who have these areas. In terms of the lifting of our oil, we have put a hold on the evaluation of the bids that came in. We made it clear in the campaign that people should not be submitting bids to an illegal government that was there at that time, and it would be unfair to people who acted decently, the companies who acted decently and did not put in a bid because they recognized the threat to democracy and you had an illegal government, that they now be excluded from the process because they're moving ahead to evaluate the bids that were received in the period when the government was illegal. So we have made it clear that we'd reopen the tender for that contract. So people, all those who did not get a chance to bid, they can then submit their bids. There are a few things, but I don't want to belabor the issue. In terms of I just want to make it clear that I've seen from the second day in office, even before we moved a single person out, already had the social media buzzing by some individuals saying we were already removing people in mass scale and all of that. Not a single person had been removed. That was the second day in government, but they started. Clearly, and then I saw former President Granger expressing some form of outrage about ministers being asked to leave, the houses, etc., that they're in. But if he were to look at his own government's experience, he would stay quiet for the next decade. And to see how people who were political appointees were, most of them resigned or moved out almost immediately, and the others were removed almost within a matter of days. And therefore, I would urge him to look at it. Now, the government, nobody, as I said before, people in this country do not have to fear in terms from the PPP or a PPP government or President Irfan Ali for their employment because they support a political party. The people who are political, they have a duty to leave. They should not even be asked in this. They're people that are overtly political. So you have a Carol Joseph, and I'm sorry I have to use her, but who gets paid from several ministries. She is part of the petroleum, she's a petroleum unit advisor to the Minister of Natural Resources in Trotman's unit. She was being paid there too. As Carol Joseph was being paid as petroleum advisor to the government. So I'm just stretching it, but she was in that unit. And so clearly This was the Carl Joseph who signed that second agreement with Mingo, the second declaration. The first one was signed by Valda Lawrence, and the second one was Carl Joseph. People like Geeta Chandan were here all the time and trying to bully the chair of GCOM. Here at the recount all along, openly trying to thwart the will of the people. And who else was here? This Van West Charles and the others. These are not, or that's how it is. You're overtly political, then you should do the decent thing and resign. They shouldn't have even asked. Look at how Harman had to be terminated. Just imagine Harman wants to work as the president for leave. He wants to work now with the government. And so we have a duty. Look, you've seen people like Imran Khan, how he's used DPI politically all along. He was a political figure. They stacked the whole, most of these natural resources agencies and also the media with people from the executive of the AFC. Large sums of money, combination. Imran Khan and his family, they're earning nearly $3 million a month. So you can understand why they were hanging on there for dear life. And then they're earning $3 million a month. So that's like 30-something million a year, 36 million. And the entire COVID response for the government has been less than $75 million. That is in assistance to the whole country, all the people who are suffering, all of them. And one family gets this. And for political purposes, not technical. I can understand if they were performing technical functions, because you do have to pay technical people. So it's obscene that they talk about this sort of political witch hunt. And we've made it clear, the president has informed me up to this morning that he wants an appeal mechanism to be available for people who may have been removed unfairly because there may be a feeling that they're political. They have an appeal to him so that he can review it. But this doesn't go for the political appointees. They must not appeal. These are for, sometimes a junior person or so get caught up in the process of removal. They can have an appeal mechanism directly to the president. But as I mentioned before, this does not go for the political appointees. How could a government implement its agenda when you have some people there who are not skilled, qualified, and all they've been doing is, you should see what some of these REOs have done. And that will come out over time. They've used the budgets of their regions not to intermediate help to people, but political expenditure. You will see on the tendering side. A lot of them are lucky that they're just being removed and not being placed before the police. And by the way, the Minister of Governance, Gail Teixeira, and Anil Nandalal, they're working together to see that the people who are removed, that the legal process is followed. That the legal process is followed for their removal. And so they should really be ashamed of even saying that the PPP is removing these people when they know how deeply embedded in the political machinery these individuals were. Deeply embedded in the political machinery and what they have done and the illegalities they've committed. So I want to make it clear, there will be no witch hunt. We want as many of our people working. As many of our people working, and that people, if they feel aggrieved, this is at the junior levels and others, they would have an appeal mechanism. They can write the president and say, I believe I've been unfairly removed, and they get an audience with either him or one of his staff, and the case would be looked at, so that that doesn't happen, which is not a courtesy that they extended to many people who were not political when we left office. Totally non-political, technical. They just removed them. People like systems analysts and all sorts of things. You know, never was single day was on a list or a political rally or, you know, made a public statement criticizing anyone, but they were removed en masse. We should go back and show a lot of those technical people. They never had a mechanism for appeal. So this is important. The restructuring of the ministries too would also work with some synergies. I'm not going to speak for much longer because already I'm going on for too long, but I just wanted, I just realized that. And so, so the government is just over a week old, and it has started working on the critical issues. Some people will be held accountable. You've heard already that there will be a commission of inquiry into what took place after in this whole period, to ensure that we never repeat this in our history, and arising out of the commission of inquiry recommendations for electoral system, etc., to strengthen it. And there would be international people on that COI. Secondly, that some people will have to bear the consequences for illegal action. That's clear. That whilst that investigations will be done into all of the illegalities and the transfers of land without collecting payment or illegally by the government, and appropriate action taken, but there's no witch hunt. We're not going to say because we don't like that individual that that person is going to be gone after. And that will be done, that will not consume the investigative work and the audits and everything else, because there has to be serious audits in all of the sectors. That will not be paralyze the government from moving forward. It's not happening sequentially. The government priority now, as outlined by the President, is to move the economy forward, deal with COVID, try to find jobs so people resume business opportunities, making sure that the police can keep people safe in their homes. That is what we're working on simultaneously as we're doing the other stuff. For the last government, they focused only on investigating, and they did not focus on addressing people's concerns. As a result, this is what we inherited. They've used up most of the money. They've left no clear strategy for the future, and we're in a sad shape today. Thank you. Yes, Marcel.
Everyone that you are Vice President, but your duties and portfolio is not yet known. Could you shed some clarity on that, on
Sure.
what you are responsible for and where you will be working out of? That is, if it's another office, if it's directly out of office of the President.
Well, the thing is that, first of all, in terms of office, we were critical of APNU for their role in denuding the office of the Prime Minister. Prime Ministers under the PPP, or Prime Minister Samuel Hines, had a weighty portfolio. He did technical work. And so we wanted to ensure, first of all, that our Prime Minister was working, had a portfolio that keeps him busy and contributing to the development of our country and the government, and that he had an independent office. He was brought in and placed in an office, in the office of the President. So the office of the president was a super ministry. A super ministry. It had, for example, several areas. Certain, I think it was public service management was done there, citizenship and immigration, culture, youth and sports, the PM office, oil and gas. All of these were on the, apart from the traditional role of the office, were under the Ministry of the Presidency. So they grouped everything. It became a super ministry, and Harman was the king of it all. So with a lot of powers, even over the Prime Minister and everyone else. So we made sure that we took these portfolios and placed them back with ministers independently. So citizenship went back to the Home Affairs under Robeson Ben. Public service management is independent. Culture, youth and sports is independent now. And the PM, oil and gas, has now been transferred formally back to natural resources. And the PM had his independent office. So the PM's office is, and you know his portfolio, the PM deals with the energy sector, a huge sector. So he'll be integrally involved in the energy solution for the country. He told us that that the production now is about 90-something megawatts, and peak is 110. So now we're producing, and I think this is the interconnected grid, less than what our peak power is, what peak demand is. So really bad shape, but our Prime Minister will look at that. He will look at telecommunication. By the way, the President has made it clear that we want an early end consistent with what he said on the platform, and we said an early end to the telecommunications monopoly. Because Cathy Hughes, although the act was passed in 2016, she signed a couple of orders bringing into being a few provisions of that act, but not the whole act, which deals with the ending of the monopoly. So that is a crucial issue. But coming back to that, so now that it's shifted out, your question you asked me, I had to give you a preamble. So the President has kept the oil, he said, oversight in oil and gas and in finance. I'm assisting him with that oversight in oil and gas and finance. I'm assisting the President to exercise that mandate. That is my responsibility at this time. That's what I'm working on. So budget-related issues and these issues I mentioned. And by the way, I'm in Nagamutu's office. Yes, so I've moved in there.
So just a clarity on Gazette.
Yes, he made a mess of that place too. Yeah, I shouldn't say that. I shouldn't be too vindictive now. Go on.
The
yes.
Gazette will state clearly your portfolio?
Yes, and it would, when the Gazette comes out, it would say, assist the President or something like that. The final form of work. I did, frankly speaking, I did not want line portfolio, like directly. That's just why we have a Minister of Natural Resources, and we will have a Minister of Finance. And please, people should not lobby too much having said that.
Okay, and my substantive question on the expert assessor for the Payara project, has that person already been identified and the funding has already
Yes, the funding has been identified, the person, and that person will be here shortly because we want to make sure that we get an early response. Thank you. Yes, I'm here. Then it's 1 minute, just across here first.
Good afternoon, sir. Payara News. Just to follow up on my colleague's question with regard to the consultant, who is the person that's been identified for this project? could you say what would be the cost to conduct this?
Okay, so it's a Canadian grant, and there will be a Canadian consultant. I don't know the exact, because I don't, as I said before, the minister deals with the agency and contracting. So you will see that shortly. But I know that that is our direction. The direction, the policy direction to the minister is we want an independent review, and we spoke with the Canadians, and they had the grant there. There was a grant already there, and that was utilized.
Okay, so my two questions, one on governance, one on the other on the local content policy. With respect to the local content policy, there have been several criticisms with regard to provisions in the local content policy for confidentiality, as well as those which go against partnership to ensure the transfer of skills and technology. Is the PPP administration going to ensure that in addressing the policy, it's going to deal with provisions that speak to secrecy and those that prevent partnership?
The way I see it is, if you adhere to the legislation, so there will be legislation. Right now, there is no legislation. It has not been drafted. So it's just a general thing from the ministry. The legislation, if you have legislation and you mandate local content, then the company has to ensure that they submit the documents to show compliance. And I don't see why, excepting for the individuals, the local people, if they don't want to know, but I don't see why it should not be released, because it should be public. They can post it on their site and to show compliance. And maybe the best way to do it is to have that done, so then people would say, no, I did not get that contract. No, I did not, that was not an opportunity what I got. So I don't see much room for this, but the consultations would deal with all of this, because there'd be widespread consultations, and we'd have the experts in before we pass legislation. We're more inclined to do this transparently, and we will still keep the promise we made, which is to criminalize non-disclosure of receipts from oil company. That is money. So if the Minister of Finance doesn't disclose in the Gazette and to notify Parliament, he'd go to jail for not disclosing how much money they collect, and there'll be a time period within which he has to make that disclosure. So we are still committed to that which we said we will do, and that will tell you every single cent that the country collects every year from the oil companies.
Thank you.
So, okay.
On the area of governance, I know that you have said several times before that the State Asset Recovery Agency would be dismantled. Given the assessment that your government has started, as well as some of the findings that you're seeing with illegalities and issues with land, do you see a place for or a role for the agency in some way, shape, or form?
We have to be advised, but right now the people who are there have not done anything, and they're incapable of doing anything to do any of this work. And many of them are political. So right now the unit has to be disbanded. The Attorney General will have to guide us in this regard to see what efforts we make, whether we have an agency or we call in the police directly, or we have, the audits done. But we don't want an agency that uses hundreds of millions of dollars per year to recover $10. Right? We don't want that. We can't afford that as a country. And therefore, that was like a sinecure unit. Sure. I can hear you clearly. All right, take it. Yeah. Yes, sure. Right.
So on the budget, you spoke about 3 weeks. Is it 3 weeks from swearing in or 3 weeks from now?
Yes, from the circular. The circular went out this week.
So there is some circular.
Circular.
Okay, and
Because the 179 was from circular.
okay.
But we're trying in 3 weeks. If it slips a couple of days, it's not a big deal, but that's what we're aiming for.
Okay, and there's a huge possibility that you can.
Yes, there is a, right now we are on track for that.
Okay, and regarding that, is it going to be a full fiscal year or just?
Well, that is why I pointed out to you that you would have to look at expenditure to date. And that is how much expenditure to date has been done, and both on the recurrent side and on the capital side through the PSIP. And a lot of these things are not properly audited. We don't know what they are made for, and some of them are downright illegal. And now we may have to, the Attorney General will have to advise us whether we'd have to give approval in the Parliament for expenditure that was made illegally. How we'd address that matter. Because, you normally put it in the estimates. So he will have to advise us as to how we approach this matter. Because I am inclined now not to approve when we go to the Parliament, not to support the approval of any expenditure that has been incurred illegally or outside of the provisions of our laws and Constitution.
But wouldn't that cause a kind of a bit of a problem for the issuance of treasury bills, those persons who would have been issued treasury bills and given the government money?
Oh, no, not on the T-bills. The T-bills are clear.
Okay.
The central bank, I'm talking about releases. For example, releases from the consolidated fund after the March. Right after March, where you can use the 112 provision. If we just say, all right, we're okay with the COVID response and the 112 provision, but how could you justify a release of $10.7 billion in loan to GPL from the consolidated fund when you don't have a budget? And even if you looked at the section of the Constitution, because they were telling me, for public services, it can't be that capital expenditure is public services, especially since the Wartsila units. It can be emergency too. They're not here as yet, and they wouldn't be here for a long while. So this is that sort of thing I'm talking about, not the monetary functions, but more from where the laws, the financial laws and the Constitution specifically prohibit an action. And then that was done.
Okay, on the Wartsila that you just mentioned, that was supposed to be here, I think, a few weeks back. Will the government be looking to get some sort of refund for the delay?
We have to wrap our heads around this. I was just looking at how many megawatts, and then you had a big story they didn't even know, and they said it's 46 megawatts, 46.5, and so we're still trying to get all the details, but clearly if there is a delay in the schedule, then there could be a need for liquidating damages. And there are some contractors who are APNU aligned who collected large sums of money. You should see the sea defenses and some schools, and they have not completed the work. They will be, I hope, I'm not saying me here, you can't quote me, but I hope the relevant ministries will institute liquidating damages on some of them.
Sir, are there any major names being contemplated now for speak of national?
No, we still, the party is going to meet over the next few days. We still are looking at regional councillors and the MPs.
I was made to understand that the rapid financial management team submitted the first of two components in the report. Can you give
I spoke with the president a few hours ago, and he had not seen it as yet. So maybe they just came over last night or so. Remember, we were isolating until the results came out.
Oh, okay.
Right.
All right. Well, I mean,
Okay.
Officer Guyana, could you say what government will consider to be a fair price for the natural gas? That's my first question.
Yeah. Dennis, that would be dealt with, as I said before, at the negotiations. When the negotiating brief is agreed, and we will then, that's an idea, because we've expressed an intent. We have to get a better deal on this. That's the intent. The technical people have to work at this, and we will insist on this, and then the negotiators will go off. I hope free is always the best price.
And sir, could you say whether Mr. British will in fact remain as the co-agent for Guyana, or he has another status within the process?
He will remain. He will remain. Yes. He will remain.
And Dr. Luncheon, Dr. Westford been hired as advisor to the government?
Who?
Drs. Luncheon and Westford.
Oh, Dr. Luncheon has not been formally hired, nor Westford. But clearly Westford has enormous experience, and Dr. Luncheon, and we hope to benefit from them. But there's been no formal engagement. There's been, we don't have, they don't have much money in the government now. They don't have much money. Remember, there is no budget. And there's very little resources now to do a lot of what we would like to do. But Roger Luncheon is very cogent. He's weak, you know, physically. But if you listen to him, he has a huge institutional memory. He hasn't lost a single ounce of his intellect. I'd rank him above 20 of the APNU ministers combined, and we must benefit from his experience. We must benefit from his experience, and we'll have no apology for him to share that experience.
Will he be eventually hired formally?
Well, this is something the president will have to look at.
Okay, and going back to the Ocean View Hotel matter, you said that the owner will have to wait a long time before anything happens in his favor. What does that mean?
That means that we have to investigate this thoroughly. We heard that the property might have been in receivership, that he didn't own the property. We are very surprised how you will demand payment and you don't have a formal lease agreement, and now claim from this government that they told you that this will be the price. Secondly, if somebody is coming into your property and start building, and you let them there for 5 months to build, and so now you know you don't have a contract. There are lots of things that don't meet the eye that are involved in this relationship. And we have to get to the bottom of this. This could very well be an incestuous arrangement. An incestuous arrangement. So they would have to answer a lot of questions, and I think that will take some time.
So will government be using the building in the meantime?
Yes, the government spent $1.6 billion of taxpayers' money. We have to put the building to use, even if not for the type of purpose that they intended, because as Dr. Anthony pointed out, you know, the flow of the air would just, there's been no allowance for that, which could infect everyone. We get into the ventilation system, no provision for oxygen in the wall, etc. And the place used to have mold. Look at the Auditor General report. When they were storing something there, the Auditor General a few years back said he found mold in the place. So if you put people who are in an emergency care, an ICU kind of unit, and that happens, they may die. So all of those things the technical people have to go through. And if they can't use it for that, we explored with Dr. Anthony the possibility of using it for quarantining purposes, just putting in beds, but only people who test positive, and then put in other facilities. Dr. Anthony doesn't have even people, the frontline workers are overworked. They've just been at this all the time for 5 months. He started some training for people to do the testing and all of that rapidly. Then, so we don't have medical people to man that hospital as yet, if you were using it. But if we use it maybe for some other purpose, say quarantining, etc., we don't need a lot of non-medical and a few medical people there. So we are exploring a lot of those options right at this point in time. But you can't expect to spend $1.something billion of dollars of public money and we'll walk away from it. That's the people's money.
Quickly, Mr. Jagdeo, last question. When can the Guyanese people see a reversal of the 200 taxes that they promised in the campaign?
That's what I said, that a lot of these things, remember, we have to assess the revenue. I told you the framework now. And we intend to keep our promises. Some will be done at budget time. Some will be done at budget time, some measures. Whether we want to keep every single one of them, but we have to look at the timing of it. Remember, a lot of this was made when the economy was booming. And let me make it clear, we also intend to keep our commitment to the sugar workers. We're right now doing an assessment of the state of the estates and stuff, but we intend to keep that commitment to the sugar workers, to the miners, to all of the people, the other sectors that we made promises to, because these are promises and policies that will put people back to work and will be good for our economy.
Preliminary, which of the taxes you hope to roll back in the budget?
I didn't get
Which of the taxes you hope to roll back?
I can't tell you that now. There has to be a policy discussion first, and then it will be dependent on costing the measures and seeing which one can go first, depending on the targeted size of the fiscal deficit, so it doesn't become inflationary nor put too much strain on the BOP through the exchange rate mechanism. So you have to look at all of those issues. And then look at what fiscal space you have and how those measures fit in the fiscal space. But given a lot of this rollover expense, that's why I was telling you on the capital side alone, a big rollover expense, that will diminish our ability to do some things because you have to pay for past policies. Well, yes, go ahead.
President, sorry for mentioning with the current COVID-19 situation in Guyana, what is the plans and discussions for the setup of Parliament?
For the setup of Parliament, I know there has been a proposal explored for the Convention Center. I know that is being explored. But Minister Teixeira could tell you a bit more about that because she deals directly with those issues. But I think it's the Convention Center, the dome, so that you can appropriately space people out. Yes, sure. Good. Yes, all right.
It's a follow-up. Given that you are on oversight for the Ministry of Finance, and you have spoken that the Minister of Finance will bring the budget in 2 weeks, has there been consultations for Minister of Finance?
No, the President makes that decision. The President makes that decision.
And on the oil and gas issue, Dr. was appointed by former President
Yes.
Granger. Do you see that as a political appointment, and what is his fate at that ministry?
What?
What is his fate at that ministry?
Fate?
Everything.
Oh, okay. A lot of people who are appointed from a technical area, I think the criticism more was about the requisite skill, because he had never worked in oil and gas before being appointed, and therefore it would be a steep learning curve, and you can't learn at the technical level. Politicians at different policy level, they listen, etc. But at the technical level, you needed somebody who could hit the ground running. You know, because from day one you're being bombarded with lots of documents of a technical nature and stuff like that. So that was the major issue, I think, at that time. So I don't know how the unit would evolve, because we have already expressed a desire to move from that a petroleum unit to commission. So there will be an evolution. Right now, there will be no change to the unit. So, but we don't want to be unfair to people and, you know, say that this person publicly, you go and say they'll be fired or not fired.
So just two quick areas. One on the interest in Block C and those relinquished offshore concessions. Is it the intention of the PPP administration to put on hold any awards until the legislative and regulatory framework is in place?
Right now, there is no intention to deal with any award. The priorities that the President has outlined are here in this, what I just told you. That is it. Awarding new areas, etc., we'll have to await all of that. That's something down the line, and we'll deal with that issue at an appropriate time. That's why I said at some point in time we have to look at a standard agreement.
And the monies in the Natural Resource Fund account, that will remain untouched until you address the issue?
No, the Sovereign Wealth Fund, that's wait for the Parliament. There will be a proposal as to that. Wait for the budget, and you will see how that would be dealt with. All right? Yes, sure.
The Ministerial, sir, can you say how much money is in the NRF at this time?
I think it's 94 million.
Okay.
I think it's 94. I could be wrong. I think it's 94 million. But I'll check it and clarify. Mm-hmm.
Secondly, on the economy, can you say what is the projected rate of economic growth, considering the...
Yes, it will be, I think, about minus 3 point something %. But remember, this is preliminary. That's why we have to work through the numbers, because the growth rate is very sensitive to the policies you put in place. And we have not decided anything on policy as yet. I just told you the mid-year decline figure. And therefore, depending on the policy measures and the lag between policy and response, you know, the economic pickup, that will have an implication on the final number. But by budget time, that number should be finalized, right? So a lot of these things. Okay then. Thank you. It's refreshing to see the Chronicle doing some